Hi everybody, this is a Design History File webinar, or DHF. I had a few clients ask me recently for any training that I might be able to provide on what is a design history file and what are the best practices on assembling one. And I had a training that I had done a while back on design controls, but I didn't have one specifically to address the design history file. And the design history file is something that's very vaguely defined by the FDA as all the records demonstrating that you followed your design plan. And that's really not helpful enough, particularly if you don't provide enough information in the FDA guidance on what you're supposed to have in your design plan either. So this is what I've created to try to help those people out. And if you have any questions, there'll be a Q&A session at the end. It'll be live. And then if you have any follow-up questions, particularly if they're proprietary, have confidential information that you may or may not want to be part of this recording, don't hesitate to shoot me an email, or you can call me. And the slide near the end also has my phone number that you can contact me at any time. I get up pretty early for Europe and I stay up pretty late for California, so you can reach me just about any time, day or night. Okay, the regulation specifically for a design history file, it's the last subpart of 21 CFR 820.30, and it's J is the subpart. And then recently, ISO 1345-2016 was updated. March 1st, they released the final draft or final version of the standard. And they've modified clause 7.3, so now there's 7.310 that specifically adds the requirement for a medical device file or medical device development file. And that's intended to not only meet the requirements for a DHF to satisfy the FDA, but it's also supposed to refer to the requirement for maintaining a technical file in design dossier for both Europe and Canada and other countries as well that require it for any medical devices. So we're going to go on to the second slide here, hopefully. Okay, slide 2. This is just a rough agenda, so I won't spend too much time on this, but if there are any things that you want me to cover in addition to what I've covered in these slides, don't hesitate to ask at the end. The first thing I like to cover whenever I'm covering regulations is to explain why it's important. And usually what that comes down to is, what will the FDA do to me, particularly when it's an FDA regulation? And so the FDA comes through and does routine inspections. They have both level 1 inspections and level 2 inspections. And the level 1 inspections are abbreviated and they don't always cover design controls, but the level 2 inspections, design controls is one of the areas they cover every single time. And based on this Pareto analysis that I did back in 2014 of 2013 fiscal year data, design controls was the #1 area they were identifying as non-conforming. However, design controls is a little bit misleading because there are so many subparts to design controls. You have parts A through J. So if you have a company that has no design controls whatsoever and they've just bought a product from another company and made changes to it and didn't do anything that they should have done for design controls and don't have a DHF, don't have a procedure, that company's going to get multiple 483s for the same issue. You don't have procedures or records. So that company is going to get maybe 4 times as many findings as really the issue deserves. It's one issue. You don't have anything. So you get 4 different 483s, and that skews the data. So if you chop this number in half, this would be somewhere in the middle of the group. I still think that when the FDA comes through and looks at campus complaints and MDRs, these are the #1 areas of concern. But for those companies out there that just don't have adequate design controls, they typically will get more than one finding in design controls. It'll be you don't have an adequate procedure, you don't have adequate design verification validation of changes, you haven't conducted design transfer when you switch from one supplier to another. So these are important details that are frequently forgotten and result in multiple 483s. Okay, so this slide just explains what I just said about the FDA inspection focus. They look at design controls. It's one of the 4 areas. The image on the right, that shows 7 different subsystems. So you have these 4 at the top, and then you have 3 minor systems at the bottom. Material controls falls under supplier controls. That's 820.50. Records and documents and change controls, that's going to be 820.180. In equipment facility controls, that's 820. I can't remember what the facility maintenance one is, but these are subsystems, whereas the 4 primary QSIT areas that they're going to look at are CAPA, management systems, design controls, and production process controls. So those are the 4 areas that I expect to see the FDA focusing on. But as you can see, they sort of split up CAPA into complaints, adverse events, and then this material controls that's links in with purchasing controls, this records and documents change controls that comes in with the Part 11 compliance. So you can see the FDA is consistent about where they're finding focus in their QSIT inspections, matches up with the areas that they're focusing in as well. So there's no surprises really there. But I think it's, in addition to making a little bit of time and downloading the QSIT manual and reading through that, particularly in the area of design history files, I think you should also understand how the FDA works. What they do is every 2 years, if they're on a regular schedule, they will come in and they will do an inspection of a company, and they'll pick one product family that they're going to look at. And they typically pick a high-risk one, usually the highest risk one, and they'll determine risk if all things are created equal. They'll determine risk based on the number of complaints and adverse events or recalls. And if they picked one product last time, they typically will pick a different product family the next time they come. So you can usually make a very short list of these are our highest risk products. This is one they looked at last time, so this is probably the one they're going to look at this time. And you usually know when they call you on Friday what they're going to look at even before they tell you. And often they will not tell you. But you should expect them to look at the CAPAs and complaints. So when they ask you about CAPA and complaints, you want to say for what product families, for what years, because that tells you what DHF they're going to look at next, and you can prepare that documentation for them and not have them waiting so long for it. You might even have a whole day of them covering CAPAs and complaints and adverse events before they even get to the DHF. So make sure you understand what product family they're looking for, what years they're looking for, and look at the complaints and adverse events and see if they're tied to any design changes, because those are the change controls that they're going to be specifically looking at. So the next thing they'll look at after CAPAs, complaints, adverse events, they're going to look at your DHF. And then after that, they're going to go after the DMR, and they're going to look at production process controls, and they're going to sample a recent DHR. And it will never be a random sample. They'll say it's a random sample, but it just happens to be the same lot that you had adverse events and complaints associated with. But they're going to want to know, I want to see this DHF that covers this design change that is linked into this recall or adverse event that you had. Slide 5 is the design controls diagram that's provided by the FDA. And everybody assumes that the FDA actually created it, but they didn't. It was actually created by Health Canada. And if you look at the original version that was printed out, it actually has in the footer reprinted with permission from Health Canada. So the FDA and Health Canada worked together a lot on many of these documents, and Health Canada took an active role in the development of the ISO 13485 standard that was written at the same time by the same committee that, or some of the same people that worked on the QSR, specifically Kim Troutman. And so you'll see this diagram links up very nicely whether you're in ISO 13485 or you're in the QSR. And I always had on this particular slide these 2 bullets over to the right. These are the 2 areas that weren't covered in the ISO standard, but now they are. They've added these 2 sections to the ISO 13485 2016 version, and so you have those included now, and now it's 10 sections instead of 7. Going on to our next slide here. This is a standard stage gate process for design, and it varies from company to company how many stages you actually have. But the one thing I seldom see is a comment about where is design transfer. A lot of companies will have it as a discrete phase by itself, but it really isn't. It covers multiple phases because it occurs over time. And the best practice is to have a design concept where you create a plan for a development project. You approve that plan, and that is the point at which your DHF should begin, because the DHF includes all the records that are associated with the approved plan. So if you don't have an approved plan, you don't need a DHF. That's the simplest way to do it. Does everybody do it that way? No, probably less than 50% of the companies do it that way, because a lot of times they wait until they get to a viable product that they're going to take it through verification and validation. And then they say, okay, now let's spend the time and money creating a design history file. So they'll create a lot of that documentation retroactively. So you have to take the design plan that you may or may not have drafted, and you have to approve that retroactively, and you have to document your design inputs and your outputs, and maybe a couple of design reviews that you might have had. But it's okay to document it retroactively. You just need records, and whether they were created at the time or not, that's okay. It appears I have a slide here with automatic advancing, so sorry about that. I will catch it as quickly as I can. The next thing that's on this form here is design freeze. Design freeze isn't an official term. It's a slang term that most design teams come up with. But the freeze concept is you're not going to change your design anymore, because now you're going to invest money in design verification and validation. And that's when design transfer occurs. So you approve those design outputs, the drawings, the specifications, the purchasing information for the suppliers, and you don't make changes from that point forward. And you might leave some things flexible and not approve them until a little bit later, but there are certain things that are long lead time items that are critical path, and you're going to freeze them as early as you can, because you want to order those items. So typically, I will say the design transfer begins right after you have your design freeze, and then your 510K product launch will be after you've had all your verification and validation done and you do your final design review. And some companies will do a design review saying it's okay to submit the 510K, and then another one to say that it's okay to commercially release once they have the 510K letter in their hands. But as long as you have one final design review, that's really the end of the design process that goes in your DHF. And it doesn't have to be linked to a 510K, but it often is, because the company or the organization that's looking at your DHF and is most critical for most companies is the US FDA. But when you have a notified body or registrar looking at your design history file, they're going to want to see that design history file as well, and they're going to want to understand when you open and close it and how you maintain it. Here's a different design control diagram, and this is called the V diagram. It's specific to software development. And it's more of a reiterative model instead of a stage gate model, because in software, you don't have expensive verification and validation activities like you do in hardware. You don't have to do simulated use on an animal or a person. You don't have a clinical study for the most part if you're just doing software. There's so many things that we can do most of the time for simulated software verification and validation, particularly with the unit testing, the integration testing, the system testing, before we even get to the simulated use testing. So that simulated use testing, I'm going to try to make my pointer up here. So here's the simulated use testing here. That's the last piece. So it sort of goes, you go from this to this to this to this, down to the software coding. You do some unit testing, verify, oh, it failed, do some more coding, try it again until you get the units working. Then you try to get the integrated system working, and you go through this loop. And then you get the system testing. And each time you fail on the software verification or validation, you might have to go back to software coding and do unit testing again. This is a very iterative process, and it takes a while, but it's fast and cheap. It's the number of cycles through that takes a while. And then the simulated use is usually last, and you might have a design freeze way out here. So it's a little bit different. So a lot of times you have design freezes here for hardware, but when you have software only, you might have a design freeze here, because now I'm going to do some validation work that's simulated use and might cost me a little bit more with users. So this is a different model, more software oriented, but it's just a diagram. You don't have to get caught up in following a diagram. You have to create a design plan and follow your design plan. And you can update that plan over time. You don't have to keep your Gantt chart forever and ever. It's a plan. Plans change. The thing is to document your plan and assess the impact of those changes to your plan. Okay, so design controls. What is the applicability of design controls? Some people say, well, I didn't think we needed design controls because we have a class 1 device, or we have a grandfathered in product, so we didn't have to do any design controls. Well, I have a company that's going through a warning letter that they've been handling for quite some time because they thought that all their changes that they made were letters to file. And a letter to file it used to be people would actually send a letter into the FDA updating their 510K file, notifying the FDA of a change, and if the FDA didn't respond, then they would be clear to go ahead with the change. Or it would just be a notification real time of, I'm going to make this change, do we need to submit a 510K or not? And most of the time, there would be no response from the FDA. And the FDA had no choice but to add it to their file because they received this document at the Document Control Center. Very few companies actually do that anymore, and now they add it to their design history file rather than actually submit it to the FDA. But you got to be very careful that the changes that you make, whether they're significant changes or not, and determine whether a 510K needs to be submitted. And the FDA has guidance on that. But cumulatively over time, you can make a bunch of small little changes, and they could trigger the need to do a new submission. For class 1 devices, in general, you're not required to follow design controls, just design transfer and documentation of design changes. However, these are 5 products here that are listed by regulation that require implementation of design controls. So there are exceptions. So not all the class 1s are exempt, and all the class 2s require design controls, and all the class 3s require design controls. And if you're in Europe, this would be analogous to ones, and ones, some of them would be exempt, some wouldn't, and the 2As and 2Bs would be class 2s in the US for the most part, though they don't match up exactly, and 3s would match up with 3s. In Canada, it's 1 through 4, but that also matches up. The 2s and 3s match up with 2s, and the 4s match up with a 3. Okay, for design planning, what I've done here is I've actually gone through each of the clauses in the QSR, and I've indicated here's what the requirement is. So, and then I've tried to put next to it what the clause is in the updated 2016 version of 1345. So 7.3.1 was split in 1345 into a general and a planning section, and the planning is where the requirement is for a design plan. And this is what's going to tell you what should be in your design history file. And they added to that documentation of methods for traceability of design outputs to design inputs and competency for the people that are on your design team. So they better be trained on design controls. They better be aware of what goes in a design history file. They should be trained on risk management. And you might even want to make sure that they're familiar with some of the standards that apply. So if you're developing software, they should probably all be trained on IEC 62304. If you're developing hardware, something electrically powered, they should probably be familiar with IEC 6601-1, probably the EMC version 2, the -1-2 for electromagnetic compatibility. If you have a sterile product, they should be familiar with the sterilization validation. And not everybody on the team needs that, but you should define the roles on the team and who's responsible for which standards. So they can specify these as design inputs and indicate how the outputs are going to be validated. And that should be spelled out in your plan up front. And the best thing to do for inputs is to specify a recognized standard by the FDA or a harmonized standard for Europe, and then the acceptance criteria for the testing. And then when you have your output, you'll indicate what you're going to need for samples. And one of the things they put in throughout 1345 2016 is the need for statistical techniques and justification for sample size. So make sure that's included in all your validation plans and verification plans. The next section of the QSR is 820.30 for design inputs, and that's 7.33 in the new version of 1345. And they've added a reference to usability. So they're now making a specific emphasis on usability. So ergonomic factors. There's a great guidance document the FDA recently published, I think it was in February, on usability and ergonomic factors. I would definitely read that. I think it's even better written than 62366, but you really need to follow this and include that in your design considerations as a design input. And so what they're going to expect as one of your DHF items is a usability report. Risk management should also be an input. And so people say, well, how do I do the risk management? Because they're used to doing risk management for a technical file at the very end of the project, but they should be doing a hazard identification at the beginning of the project. I'll show that later. But that should be an input into their design process. And then post-market surveillance is now required as a design input, and that's from clause 8.2.1. You also have to, this is wording used from the QSR. It says it must define a mechanism for addressing incomplete, ambiguous, or conflicting requirements. And as I indicated there, what the best practice is. For outputs, think drawings, specifications, labeling should be included. That's one of your outputs, so don't forget labeling. You should include purchasing information. That includes which vendor that you're going to buy it from, what documentation requirements come with the components or the finished device that you're purchasing, and any revision changes should be documented in outputs. A lot of time when you go from your stage where you're developing the device to the stage where you're verifying the device, the signal that we're now entering design transfer and we're verifying and validating and you've reached design freeze is often the change in the revision of those drawings and specifications. A lot of companies will go from a numeric engineering revision to an alpha revision. Some companies do the reverse. They go from an alpha to a numeric. It doesn't matter as long as you make it clear. We're now in design transfer and this is how we know, and this is how we keep track of changes. But there have been no changes to the output section in 1345-2016. For reviews, one of the requirements is to have an independent reviewer, but a lot of people think independent must be outside the company. It isn't true. You can have somebody that's inside the company be an independent reviewer as long as they didn't work on that phase of the design project. You should have at least one design review at the end of the project before commercial release. Ideally, you'd have multiple design reviews at multiple phases, but if you have a very simple project where you're doing a device modification and you're not changing any of your inputs, you're only changing an output and revalidating, that would be a good case for we're just going to do one final design review and we're not going to have all these other reviews, and you would indicate that in your plan. So make sure your design control procedure allows you to have abbreviated plans and specify the details in your design plan. Give them a suggested outline for your design plan, but then the specific one is product specific, project specific, and it's all outlined how many design reviews you're going to have and what steps you're going to go through verification and validation. If you're using justification for not doing all the verification and validation over again, include those scientific rationales or the writing of them somewhere in your plan so people get that done. In the 2016 version added, records include design under review and participants involved in the date of the review. Those are things that are in the QSR, so that's not really a change. It's just being a little bit more clear that you must meet the regulatory requirements when you do design reviews. And I have yet to see a design review where we didn't include who were the participants in the date of the review or what design is being modified. Usually you have a project name. For design verification, this is subsection F. As I said before, they've added statistical techniques and a rationale for sample size. So that's throughout this. And a lot of people aren't sure what's verification activities and what's validation activities. They can get confused. And it's not all that hard to get confused when you have something like sterilization validation is considered a verification activity. You're verifying that you can meet the sterility assurance claims of the packaging. You're not validating the device in a simulated use. So that's a verification activity, and it gets confusing because the word validation is in there because you're validating the process. Any benchtop testing you're doing, a lot of the external testing standards, harmonized standards, recognized standards, those are all verification for the most part. And if you do FEA, which is finite element analysis or other simulations, particularly in software, these things are going to be all verification activities. You also want to make sure all of those are included in your design inputs. Okay, so design validation. Once again, statistical techniques and rationale for sample size. You want to be clear, both in verification and validation, what is worst case scenario and why. You might have the smallest and largest size, you might just have the smallest size, you might just have the largest size. If you can't come up with a rationale for worst case scenario, then use a cross sampling. You can have one of each size if you wanted to and pool the results. That's okay too. I've done that a lot for biocompatibility or for bioburden or for sterilization validation, particularly when you don't want to make all of one size. You want to make a little bit of every size and then randomly sample from that. You want to make sure you're using production equivalents whenever you're doing the verification and validation testing. And you may be doing preclinical testing on animals, cadaveric studies, and clinical studies. So now you're going to have pre-transfer design changes. If you make a design change prior to design freeze, breathe a sigh of relief because you haven't spent all that money on verification and validation yet. So you should be updating your design plan because you had something go wrong, something failed, or you had a hiccup, and you're going to have to change your plan, and you're going to have at least a delay. You might have identified that this material that you'd hope would work so well no longer is going to work with your sterilization process, so you have to identify compatibility with the sterilization method as a design input. Maybe you skip that and need to add that as a hazard. You might have a change in your input-output verification validation matrix. That's the IOVV. Some people also call it a design requirements matrix. So those are the three documents I would expect to change. My input-output matrix, so I'd maybe change an input or change an output. I'd identify a hazard that goes in my risk management file, and I'd update my design plan. Those are the things I would expect to see changes of before I hit design freeze, before I've done verification and validation, before I start transfer. And the design dossiers require a summary of design changes, but you don't really have to include every single design change prior to release of the product. They're mostly concerned with design changes post-transfer, post-market launch. It's good to identify some of the large changes that signified, we changed the project plan, but you don't have to identify every single little tiny minute change that you made during the development process. Hit the highlights, because this is pre-transfer, pre-verification validation. For post-transfer changes, if you're going to have any changes to a PMA product, or you're going to have a design dossier, there are going to have to be supplements and verification validation documentation submitted and pre-approved by the regulator. So it's a PMA, it's going to be FDA approval, and if it's a design dossier, it's a notified body. And this would be for the high-risk devices. So this is one of the reasons why, even if you have a clinical study, you really want this to be a 510K device rather than a PMA product. You don't want those PMA supplements. Okay, design transfer. So we're rapidly approaching the point at where we're going to actually get to the regulation for the design history file. For design transfer, they've added some new language. All the things in red are new. And there's a new requirement for a procedure for design transfer. That wasn't in there before. It was required by the FDA, but people sort of ignored it, or they embedded it in part of their design control procedure and didn't have a really good way of documenting that they have design transfer under control, such as a checklist for design transfer. So that's one of the tools you might have. You don't have to have a separate procedure. You can embed it in your design control procedure, but you should have something very clearly identified as a design transfer document to make it clear how you're verifying the product has been transferred adequately to production. You want to make sure that all your outputs have been verified against the inputs in the final specifications can meet that the product can meet the product specifications and has capabilities. So typically process validation and CPKs are very common. CPK is a process capability coefficient that's used a lot for process validation. And I often link that to risk management and risk controls. And you want to have all the conclusions of your design transfer recorded somewhere in that documentation. This all, again, goes into your design history file. Design changes. So we talked about pre-changes, so pre-transfer changes, but then you also have post-transfer changes. And that isn't really where I would normally have design changes covered. I normally have it in two places. I'll have a separate engineering change control document for changing products that are already on the market. And then I'll have a separate section on design changes in my design controls procedure for changes made prior to approval of the final product. So you want to have two different processes and two different levels of control, because you don't want to have the same level of control for something that hasn't even gone through verification and validation yet and isn't on the market. You can have much less control there. But before you make the changes, you need to review them, you need to verify them, validate them, and approve them. So if it's post, you still have to do all those things. If it's pre, you're still going to have to do all those things. So either way, you have to review the change, verify, validate, and approve it. There's also now a requirement for a procedure for design changes. And so you want to make sure you're addressing both pre and post changes. You want to also assess the impact on any constituent parts, accessories, things like that, any production processes when you make these design changes, particularly if it's at an outsourced contract manufacturer. The automotive industry uses a tool called a PPAP. So whenever they make a change before a new model year, they have this qualification of the production process, and they have an actual observation by a team. Okay, and you, of course, have to have records that are going to go in your DHF. And this brings us to our final requirement, which is the design history file requirement, which is clause 21 CFR 820.30J and ISO 1345-2016 clause 7.3.10. The phrase used in the ISO standard is design and development files. But every manufacturer is required to establish a DHF for each type of device, and the FDA specifically says that you can go ahead and you can have, there's somebody here that's not muted. I don't know how that happened. So you have, when you do a design history file, if you make, if you have a design history file that applies to a family of products, it's okay to have a design history file that's a family if it's minor changes in like sizes. But if you have significant differences, particularly in intended use for the products, they probably shouldn't be part of a family. We have the same thing happen with CE marking technical files. Companies want to group as many products as they can into one technical file. But if you have a different clinical evaluation for the products, you have a different IFU for the products, and a different risk management file for the products, you probably don't have a strong case for grouping them together as a family. So that's something you have to keep in mind. You also have to reference in your design history file all these documents that you've created over time that match up with your design plan. And you don't actually have to have a binder per se. You don't have to have a big, thick 3-ring binder with all the documents in there and keep everything paper-based. You don't have to have an elaborate electronic control system where everything's software either. But you can have a design history file where it references all these control documents. So that is allowed, but it should follow your design plan. So whatever your plan says, that's what should be in the DHF. And you want to make sure that if you don't have the records in there, you at least have a reference to them, and I would recommend controlling them. It's not letting me advance. Okay. So slide 19. I hope everybody was able to see that slide. So slide 19, it's what I call the 2-hump diagram. And this explains you have a research process for design and you have a development process for design. And a lot of times companies will play around with a new material or a concept and be involving an industrial design firm to come up with concepts and get focus groups to give preliminary feedback on it, just trying to meet the user needs. Would this be what you're looking for? And once they come up with a product that people give a thumbs up to, at least in concept, then they'll put together a design plan and a budget for the project and identify the regulatory pathway. And when they approve that design plan, that's when the DHF should begin. So you've been doing a little bit of research, but not a lot of research. What some companies will do, as I said before, though, is they'll wait until almost all the research is done, they've developed the product, and they're just about ready to approve all the outputs, all the specifications and drawings, And when they've gotten that far along, now they have a lot of work to retroactively put in their DHF, and they're much closer to the product launch. Now I've superimposed that previous diagram I had with the phase gate development process, and I've superimposed it upon the R&D two-hump diagram, so you can see that. And now I'm adding risk management activities. So as I said before, risk management activities are supposed to be an input into the design process. Specifically, the things you'd be looking for are hazard identification and the risk management plan. The risk management plan should identify what activities you're going to conduct for risk management throughout the design process. And a good place to put it would be as a subsection of your design history file, your design plan, but it doesn't have to be. It can be a separate standalone document. But the risk management plan for design projects just articulates when you're going to have these different activities and what they are. The hazard identification should be an input, and there's a lot of ways to identify hazards. I cover that in some of my risk management training, but things to look at are ISO 14971. Look at Annex C, has a bunch of questions. Annex E has a systematic way of identifying it. And then, of course, you can look at the MAUDE database for adverse events and identify Pareto analysis of failures of devices that are in a similar category. And then these are more the traditional risk analysis, risk estimation activities that you conduct. Here's risk control option analysis that you might do in verification and validation. And you need to do a risk-benefit analysis if it's CE marked or it's a high-risk device. And then you have a final risk management report that summarizes all the activities that you conducted for risk management over the life of the product. But there's one more thing that isn't on here, and that is you're going to need a risk management plan for post-production. So how are you going to gather post-production risk data? And usually the best way to do that is to include it in your post-market surveillance plan. And you should be writing a draft of your post-market surveillance plan right about here when you start doing verification and validation to see how the product's going to fail and all the kinds of bugs and problems you'll have with it. And you're doing maybe a clinical evaluation during this period. You might be doing simulated use testing. You might be doing a clinical study. That's a great time to be writing this post-market surveillance plan and to incorporate the risk management gathering as part of that plan. And then you would finalize and approve it right here at product launch, so you use that updated risk management plan as part of the post-market surveillance plan for the life of the product while it's on the market. So, as I said before, slide 22, when do you implement design controls? Really, design controls is at the very beginning of a project. You want to be documenting everything you're doing right up front. You want to have design meeting minutes. You want to define your team. You want to be training people, make sure they're competent in design controls and risk management, because you don't want to have to create a bunch of things retroactively and find out you have to redo things because you didn't do it correctly. So usually I'll implement a lot of the forms for design controls in a startup company before we even have a procedure for design controls. Then we'll implement design controls they'll be using the design control process in the forms before they even have a quality system in place. And so it's really your first quality system process, but then of course you have to approve your document control procedure and your record control procedure before you can approve your design control procedure, because otherwise you don't have any method for reviewing and approving design control procedure or archiving all the forms that you've created over time. So a lot of these procedures will be in place but not approved. And then once you get far enough along in a development project, you'd say, okay, now let's implement document control, record control, and approve our design control procedure and our risk management procedure. And as I said, retroactive implementation is not all that uncommon. But design controls often is excluded for contract manufacturers unless they have design in their the scope of their quality system and they're being hired by a customer to do some development or design of a component or a finished device. So when do you start the DHF? As I said before, with that two-hump diagram, you've started into your research, you're not yet into development, you've come up with a plan, you've got a concept, you approve the plan and approve the budget for the project, you assemble the team, define the roles in the team. That's the point at which the DHF should be initiated, and you probably would have a kickoff meeting at that point and define how you're going to document all the records in the design history file. So once again, not uncommon to do things retroactively, but it's not ideal. When should you close your DHF? After the product has regulatory approval is the best practice. The reason why is that way, when the FDA comes in and they want to know about design changes, you can say, well, this was the original 510K and we made these changes afterwards, and here's the verification and validation we did, and here's our letter to file indicating why we didn't have to do a new regulatory submission. So you want to keep it separate. Here's what was approved and here's the post changes. That also helps you evaluate whether you need to do a catch-up 510K because you have a cumulative number of changes that is so great that even though each change by itself wasn't great enough to necessitate a 510K for device modification, the cumulative changes is great enough you need to do a catch-up 510K. And some companies will just do as a matter of course. They'll do that periodically to make sure that when the FDA comes through an inspection, they don't get a finding. So if you make a bunch of little tiny small changes, rather than expose your company to a warning letter, you might go ahead with a 510K just prophylactically and say, we're going to do a catch-up 510K just before we're due for another FDA inspection so that we can say we've done that. But we don't feel it's great enough of changes to justify that, but we're just making sure that we've covered ourselves. So that brings everything current. Not done by a lot of companies, but companies that have gotten warning letters for this have taken that approach. You don't want to keep the DHF open post-release because all those changes are going to be covered more rigorously than the pre-release design changes, and that should be covered under that separate procedure for design change control that's post-production. You're also going to have references in your DMR and tech file index for post-release design changes, and oftentimes I'll include that as a revision history. So I can identify each of those. Let's say you use the acronym ECN for Engineering Change Notice. Every ECN or ECO will be listed under my DMR and tech file index, indicating that this was a post-production design change, and here's the verification and validation if you look up that ECN or ECO. Okay, we got a few more minutes here. We're almost to the end of the slide deck. Minimum requirements for certification. So this would be certification of your design control process. You may be getting ISO certified before you actually have finished your first design project. And in that case, you need to give them something to look at, otherwise you won't get certified. But you don't have to have a complete design done. A lot of companies are doing it prior to getting their product in a clinical study. So you would have procedures for design controls, design change, design transfer. You would have possibly a procedure on how to assemble a technical file, and you would have forms associated for design reviews, design plans, maybe even design inputs and outputs like an IOVV or design traceability matrix. Maybe some risk management documentation should be included as well. You would have training records, including effectiveness and competency. Remember 7.3.2, they now require competency on training for design controls and risk management. And you want to have at least one design project in progress. You have to have some records. You don't have to have the DHF completed, but you have to have some records in there. So an approved design plan, maybe a design meeting, maybe you've conducted a hazard identification and had approved design inputs. That would be great. And maybe now you're playing around with some concepts and you're doing some preliminary screenings to make sure it's compatible with the sterilization process, or you're doing software development, you're doing iterative design of the different units, subunits of the software, each module of it. That'd be a great place to be as a minimum requirement. You're not done, so in the auditor's notes, they'll say this project is still under development. They don't have any other projects at this time, but it appears to be adequate and they're following it and they're trained on it. So we will continue to review this in subsequent audits as they get further along in the design project. So the auditor comes back each year, and then when they come back the second year, maybe you finish that design project. Slide 26, we have a recommended DHF contents. So this is recommended. It's not required. There's no place where it says what you need in it. All they say is you need all the records according to your design plan. So design plan's got to be in there. It might not be a bad idea to include a copy of your procedure in there as well. I don't have that on that list, but it's a very good idea because they always ask for that, and it's kind of nice to have the design procedure, at least the revision of it that was used for that design project, actually in the file, whether it's virtual or physical. One of the things that I've identified over time that people ought to do is if they make a change to their design control procedure. So you have a 2-year project, it's unlikely that you're not going to have any project change or any changes to your design control procedure over 2 years. You're probably going to make some minor updates. So it's helpful to know when did you use the old version of the procedure and when did you use the new version. And to make everything simple, I recommend implementing the new version of the procedure at the next design review. So you would indicate that in the document change, you're going to say this is going to be implemented for all new projects right now and any existing projects, and you would list those in your approval. The following projects will be implemented at the next design review. And that way it makes it very clear this is before, so we use this version, this is after, we use this version, and you might update your design plan at that review as well. It's a good idea to update your design plans at every review, in my opinion. For user needs, you're going to include that, inputs, outputs, including labeling. And a lot of times I'll use either an IOVV or design requirements matrix to document user needs, inputs, outputs. And then you're going to have verification and validation for each of those inputs and outputs. You'll have the design review meeting minutes, and you can organize your binder or your electronic system by design phase, or you can organize it by document type. It's up to you. Just define how it should be organized somewhere in a design control document. You should have all the inputs and outputs, user needs, verification, validation, all identified. You want traceability. So I've actually seen 510Ks where the FDA went through each and every single risk and made sure that it was identified in your verification and validation. And when one wasn't, they said, please show additional information on this or provide a justification for why you didn't. Your risk management file, you may include each of those documents that were the risk management activities that I identified in the risk management plan, or you might just have a summary report that references all of those. So a risk management report typically will be a STED or a summary technical document, and that will identify each of the risk management activities were done and the document that was produced for them. And then you'll have a hyperlink in a virtual system to that actual document that might be controlled in your electronic archives. As I said, at the beginning of design transfer, you might start writing a post-market surveillance plan. It might be a draft, and then you finalize it when you launch the product. That might include post-market risk management data collection. You might have a clinical data summary if you do a clinical study, or a clinical evaluation report if you're doing a literature search route, or a combination of the two. You might create a DMR/tech file index. This should be part of those design transfer activities, because when the FDA comes, they're going to actually want to see that DMR. It's not the design history, it's all the current procedures, forms, inspection criteria, and drawings for that product, as well as the purchasing information for that product. It would say what process parameters you're supposed to use on any validated processes. And then last but not least, you'd have the regulatory approval, and that's typically when you'll close a DHF. And then after that, you have post-production design change control. You need to maintain effectiveness of your design process. And in order to maintain that, you should have, it's very hard to keep these binders organized when you keep on changing your plan. So if people organize things by document type and you change the document type, things get confusing. So a lot of times, most companies will just default to a chronological organization of the design history file, and they'll put a tab in at each design review to indicate the different phases in the project. But the meeting minutes in general have way too much detail in them that you may or may not want to have audited. So at the very least, I would organize it as an appendix, or I might even just file it and say this is where meeting minutes can be found if we're looking for a detail. But I try to make the things that are details in the meeting minutes and not include them in the file unless absolutely necessary. Because a lot of times there's some discussion in there considering options that you may not want audited, particularly by the FDA in the case of a recall. You might use an index if you want to instead of binders, but I tend to use only the indexes for the design, for the device master record and the technical file, not for the design history file. Because you really want it to follow your design plan. And if procedure changes are made, I said implement those at the design review. and maintain all the documents as controlled documents. This is something a lot of companies won't do. They don't want to do it because all the review and approval and signatures. But you can have a design process where they're engineering level and they only require 1 or 2 signatures from the design team members that actually created the document, rather than multiple levels of approval. And then when you hit design transfer, that's when you can approve them with full alpha control and multiple signatures. If you're going to audit design controls, I actually wrote a blog about that, and I have a webinar that I taught on the process approach to auditing, where I discussed turtle diagrams as a best practice. And I explained this model here with the rings. The blue rings are adjacent processes, such as the design process, and then it would be you'd feed into the design process from post-market surveillance and customer requirements, and it would be an output into purchasing. And each of those rings is an adjoining ring or adjoining process, such as document control would be this ring right here. Post-market surveillance and product realization planning would be this input. This would be validation. This would be training. This would be design transfer and purchasing. And this would be monitoring and measurement of processes, as well as management review. Here's some additional resources. Some of these are links to my website that have a lot more blogs on it. Other things you'll find in guidance documents as well. So you might look through some of these, but most of them are from my website, giving you a list of many documents that will walk you through the design process and risk management process and how to create technical files. So a lot of people find those very helpful. Now we come to the Q&A portion. So if you want, you can email me. I will check my emails in a moment here. You can also call me or email me offline to discuss more confidential information. And I'm going to check my emails right now to see if I have anything new. Okay, so I have one person said they just purchased it at 10:40, so they're a little bit late. But I will make sure I send them the webinar information. I don't see any questions from anybody. And I don't see anything in the chat box. So I'm going to go on to my next slide where I had some people with questions. And I have one person that keeps on managing to get themselves unmuted. I don't know how I made them a speaker, but I did. Maybe they log out and log back in and they become a speaker again. So questions that were asked, this was actually submitted to me as a question, and I actually wrote a blog about it today. So you might want to check out my blog page. So it's medicaldeviceacademy.com and then /blog. And there's an actual article about this first question here. But the person said, do you have a sample Word copy of a DHF of a medical device? And they were looking for a template. And what I indicated is there's really no such thing as a template, because every single design project is different. You have a design control procedure that has required elements for a design plan, but then you customize your plan for the project. You would absolutely not want the same type of DHF for a software-only product as you would have for an X-ray machine, or as you would have for an IV catheter. Those would be 3 totally different design plans with very different structures of your DHF. And if you have a class 1 product versus a class 3 product, those DHFs are going to look really different as well. So in general, I recommend that you have a template for your design plan, and it's not you shall have all the elements in your design plan. It's more of a, here's the recommended content for a design plan, but you can modify it for the specific product. And you might even give some hints in your procedure saying, for instance, if it's a minor device modification, you might have fewer reviews and only have 1 review at the end. You might not change your design inputs at all and might keep the design inputs exactly the same as the previous version of the device. You might not have any new hazards to identify, so you might just skip all the way to the design outputs, where all we're going to do is change, let's say, one of the electrical components became obsolete because they don't have a RoHS, they don't have a leaded version anymore, and now it's RoHS compliant, so we have to make that kind of change. Maybe they obsoleted a screen. Maybe we're making it bigger. Maybe we added Bluetooth. Those would be examples of minor design changes that you might just have a very abbreviated project for. So in general, I don't have a good template for a DHF. I have a great template for design meeting minutes, design requirements matrix or traceability matrix. I have a design control procedure, risk management, post-market surveillance plan, but I don't have one for the DHF because it should follow your design plan. And who should receive this training? So somebody asked this, anybody that's responsible for participating in the design team should receive this training here, as well as training in general on design controls and risk management. An exam is a great way to demonstrate training effectiveness. I typically will have a 10-question quiz with multiple choice, fill in the blank, fairly straightforward, usually 10 questions, and I usually have 70 as passing. But all that does is make sure you are paying attention and learn the material. It doesn't mean you can actually do the job. So competency is something different. And some companies will say, well, I verified competency through internal auditing. But if you don't specifically interview the person that was responsible for being in that part of the project and review their training records and show what they did, you're not really doing a good enough job of showing competency. Other things that you can do to demonstrate competency is, well, the person's resume. They went to a formal class, they took an exam, they participated in multiple projects, they've designed products in the past that were medical devices. These are all things, skills, education, training, resume, that would go into demonstrating competency. So it's not necessarily just something you did at that company, it can be all the things you've done prior to that company. And then risk management training should also be included, not just this training today. So somebody asked a question here, so I'm going to try to look at my chat box here a little bit. So the chat box, I'm sorry if I lost any of you here, at least what you can see on the screen. So the first question here is, could you explain in more detail the differences between the DHF, the DMR, and the technical file? So the DHF is the design history file. The FDA loves their acronyms, by the way. They even refer to TLA as three-letter acronym. Any organization that has an acronym for acronyms has some issues. So the design history file is the history of your design project. And typically it's closed when you approve the product and launch it on the market. The DMR is the most current version of the drawings and procedures, including inspection procedures and labeling for the product. So that was your outputs. Your DMR doesn't include any inputs. It doesn't include verification and validation. It includes the procedures, the inspection criteria, and the drawings and the labeling. And then your technical file is supposed to also be that compilation of those things, but they also want to see the verification and validation. They want to see the inputs and outputs. So when they do a technical file audit, they're going to ask for a combination of your design history file and your DMR. So what I typically have is I have a technical file index and a DMR index, and they serve one and the same, and I might have more information in my DMR than you normally need as a minimum, but it sometimes eliminates people needing to go dig into my DHF because often they're looking for the most recent change. But technically, the key differences between the DMR and the technical file, one is required by the FDA, and it's just the most current outputs, whereas the technical file will include information about the device, the verification and validation activities, the inputs, some of the risk management documentation that would not be in the DMR. So the technical file is more comprehensive. It's sort of a hybrid between the two. Whereas the design dossier is going to be the full-blown DHF and the DMR together, because the design dossier wants all your design changes over time rather than the most current version. So that, I hope, answers that question. The same person came back with another question. Could I please explain what is a letter to file? So this is a slang term that people came up with I'm sure at one time it was much more formal. From what I've been able to gather about the formality of it, there were actually some companies in 1996 that were actually submitting letters to file to the FDA that would reference the 510K file, and it would be a device modification, and they would say, we're not submitting a new 510K, we're making this minor modification. Please let us know if we need to submit a new 510K for a device modification. And the reason why they were doing this was just practical. The regulations were a few months old, and everybody was still up in arms on how to even audit it, and inspectors didn't know what to do. Didn't know what should be covered, what shouldn't be covered. So as a practical matter, to cover people's butts, they would submit these device modification letters to file to the FDA, to the document center. And then if the FDA came back with any response, they would know they need to submit a 510K to catch up. And most of the time, what would happen is if you had a whole bunch of changes, they would say, well, you didn't file this change. And say, oh, yes, we did. Here it is. But the FDA didn't acknowledge it. So that was technically what a letter to file was. What it is today for most companies, it's something that somebody put in their design history file after they launch the product, or more likely, it's an ECO or an ECN documenting a change after the DHF was closed, but it's a design change, so you have to verify and validate. And maybe you updated your inputs, maybe you just updated outputs, but you certainly probably did some verification and validation or justified why you don't need to. And so that would be cross-referenced in your DHF with maybe a revision history, but it wouldn't be actually part of it. It would just be a reference to. Or you could do the reverse. You could also reference it in your DMR or your technical files. So there's a lot of ways you can do that, but that explains the difference of what it used to be versus what it has become. If anybody has some insight on that, you probably have more than 30 years of experience. And keep in mind, I started out in the medical device industry in 2000 and had quality and regulatory responsibility in 2003. So some of these regulations were already 7 years old by the time I got involved. And a lot of these question marks had already been worked out, and they seemed very clear to everybody at that point. The next question was, DHF is related product documentation, while the DMR is related to the production process. I don't know what technical file is, though. So the DHF isn't just product documentation, it's all the records that show that you followed your design plan for a project. And it could be an abbreviated project, so it might not include previous versions of the design. It might just include the current design project, which is a modification. So you might have multiple DHFs for the same product. The DMR is not just the production process. The DMR includes all the drawings and inspection criteria and the labeling. So it's the current approved outputs. Doesn't include the inputs, doesn't include the risk management documentation. The technical file, or TF, that is, it's not actually even an official term in the medical device directive or the ISO standard. They instead call it technical documentation, but everybody uses the slang term technical file because it's often a file. And typically, most of the notified bodies are requiring it be submitted as PDFs in an organized fashion according to your procedure. And they want to see summary technical documents defining what verification and validation activities did, what your inputs were, what your outputs were, what the design plan was. That goes under design history. But they just want a summary of it. They don't want the whole thing and all the records like the DHF. So it's a summary. And the DMR, all the contents of the DMR are included in the technical file because it's going to be the most current outputs. So that's important. If you have a design dossier, you're going to add to that revision history over time. And so that's oftentimes I will include that as cross-references to ECNs and ECOs. One more person asked a question here. They say, thanks for the great presentation. Thank you. Always like the compliments, and don't hesitate to give a testimonial. And do I have an example of what to include in a risk management plan for post-market surveillance? Okay, so I'm actually working on that as a response to a client actually today. So please shoot me an email about that particular question, and I will try to respond to it later on today. And from but what I would include in there, if you look at, if you're looking at it, you want to be gathering each of your complaints through the post-market surveillance process, as well as non-complaints like literature data, mod database for competitor products, different things like that. And you're going to be also service data you're going to be reviewing, and you're going to have that as an input into the design process to assess whether you need to make corrections to the design or improvements to the design. So that's one of the ways that you're going to include it. You're also going to be assessing whether all the risks that you are seeing in reality match up with what you estimated in the design project. So are the severities correct? Are you identifying, are you missing some risks? So some hazard wasn't identified during the risk management process and now it's showing up. Are there some indications for use that you didn't anticipate, some off-label or foreseeable misuse? That's often very common, foreseeable misuse. So those are some things that should be included for the risk management plan for post-market surveillance. And then they say, from my experience, we need to review annually the content of our product DHF and risk management files. If you have a brand new product that you launch on the market that's fairly high risk, you might want to do it at 90 days. If you have a class 3 device, you're going to have to do it at 90 days. That's pretty routine to do it that quickly for a high risk or a brand new product. If you have a product with very little change that's stable, that's been on the market for a long time, you might even be able to push it out to 3, 4, 5 years. So annual reviews might not be necessary, but you're going to review your post-market surveillance data on a periodic basis, and the annual is pretty common for a stable product that's been on the market and doesn't have a lot of adverse events. And your conclusion of your post-market surveillance report should be, no, there's no need to update our risk management file, or no, there's no need to update our clinical evaluation report, or stay on the schedule that we're on and it'll get updated next year or 2 years from now. You want to have a conclusion that says there's no need to do an update at this time, or we'll stay on the schedule that's in our plan for updating the risk management documentation and the clinical evaluation. The DHF is not going to get updated. The DHF is closed. So what you're going to be updating is the DMR and the technical file. The technical file would include the risk management file. But just because you updated the risk management documents doesn't mean the design history file is updated. You're just updating the risk management documents. Okay, we got a lot of questions here. For a Class 2 product, the DHF is closed upon regulatory approval. When is it closed for a Class 1? I should have anticipated that question. Okay, so you're not technically required to have it for have design controls for some of these Class 1 products. A lot of them are exempt, and you only have to do design transfer. So you would do a design transfer process. You would review and approve your outputs, and you'd have a design review checklist ideally, and you document that the checklist was filled out, and that would be the contents of your DHF. But because you're not required to completely comply with design controls for a Class 1 product, you're exempt in most cases, then you're not required to have a design plan. If you have a Class 1 device that's not exempt, but it is exempt from a 510K, and those exist, and you even have Class 2s that are exempt from 510K. In these cases, you're going to have a design plan, you're going to have a design project, you're going to have all the documentation, you're going to have your DHF. When do you close it? Your final design review when you launch the product. So whether it's tied to the regulatory approval or it's tied to the final design review when you release the product for commercialization, that's when you're closing the file. It's one or the other. Where it gets a little bit more complicated is when you have multiple countries and it gets launched at different times in different countries. And that's part of your design transfer activities that you're going to be monitoring over time. And that's up to you how you're going to do that. Some people will have supplements for each country that'll just be an additional design review for each country launch. Somebody has, they didn't put in a question, they just said Europe technical file. So I'm assuming that they're just clarifying a question or something here. The next one, for a simple device, can all this work be done in by one or two people? Well, in general, you can do a design project with just a few people, but they want it to be a cross-functional team. You should be representing the customer's perspective. You should have somebody that's competent in design controls and risk management. And you should also be covering the regulatory requirements and the quality system requirements and production process controls. So you're going to need somebody from purchasing and manufacturing. Could you do all this stuff with one or two people? Well, if those people are, if you got a virtual company and you got two people that have been there, done that, and have every job in the company, like I have, you might be able to get away with it, but you're still going to need somebody to be an independent reviewer at the design reviews. So that's where sometimes companies will hire consultants. But just to have, if you literally have a virtual company with one or two people and you're outsourcing all of manufacturing, you might want to invite your contract manufacturer into that design review so you have an additional perspective from the manufacturing side. And you should really consider bringing in somebody that's a regulatory expert if you don't already have that expertise, and maybe use them as an independent reviewer. So those are some things to think about. But yes, in theory, you could have just one or two people, as long as one person's an independent reviewer at the design reviews. And if they're an independent reviewer, they haven't participated in that part of the project. So they were working on some other project or they're outside the company. Okay, more questions. So how significant should a change be before it's required to do design control? Let's say we decide to change the print tape to another one. Would you then do control with an independent reviewer and such? Well, if you're making a device modification, that's design change control, and that's why the FDA and the ISO standard are requiring a separate procedure for design changes as opposed to design controls of a new product. And so you could have a different process for that, and you could get away potentially from having an independent reviewer because it's not part of design controls development, it's part of design change. But you're going to do full-blown verification and validation or have a justification why you have skipped some of the verification and validation activities. And you're going to update your DMR, and you're going to update your risk management file, you're going to update your technical file. So there's a lot of things that you're going to have to update when you make this kind of a change. You might have regulatory notifications, but it's up to you. They say right in the ISO 1345-2016 that you have to assess, review, and approve the impact of changes. And a lot of companies do a poor job of that. So how tightly you control that's up to you, but it can be risk-based. That's one of the things that the 1345 standard now emphasizes. And so I'm not quite sure the terminology of print tape, but I'm assuming that we're talking about some sort of labeling, and in that case, or a printer tape from some sort of printer and accessory that's printing out data from a monitoring device. So that should be a minor change, and you should be able to do just the verification and validation that was required the first time for that component. And it shouldn't impact other areas, and you should document that. So no, you don't have to do full-blown design controls. You don't need necessarily a design independent reviewer. You probably wouldn't even open up a new DHF. You would document it as a design change instead. Somebody liked my answer, so that's good. And last question on my list here. We are a design firm. We complete the DHF and transfer design to outsource manufacturing for production. However, we have the responsibility or liability for the product manufacturing. Do we need to have the complete DMR on file, or could we only have the design part of the DMR, design drawing, design specs, and design changes, and have the manufacturing DMR production procedure, inspection procedure at the contract manufacturing site? Sorry. Absolutely. You can certainly have documents in multiple places at multiple companies. Whenever you have they actually made it mandatory now in ISO 1345-2016 that when you outsource processes that you have to have a supplier quality agreement in place defining roles and responsibilities, and that would include the maintenance of records. So the DMR is a record of the most current version of the design and manufacturing process, and the DHF is the record of the design that was formed according to the design plan. So you would probably have DHF responsibility, and you would split the DMR responsibility between your two companies, but you would probably want the authority to review and approve, and the FDA wants any changes that they make you're notified of in writing, and you have a chance to review and approve those and make sure they're validated. So that would be, once again, part of that change control process and part of the new requirement for supplier controls. So I think that covers all our questions for today. We actually are at an hour and 15, so the training went over, but everybody will get a recording of the whole thing. Thank you very much for your participation. And as I said, don't hesitate to shoot me any emails with questions or give me a call. Thank you very much, and have a nice day. Bye-bye.